All the Kumeyaay, all 18,000 Kumeyaay, were not involved in the sacking of this mission. It was a very clan-specific sacking, and it was the villages, the warriors south of the San Diego River. So for years, while people knew about it, people didn't address the differences between the group called the Tipai, which is a northern branch of the Kumeyaay, slightly linguistically different, and the Tipai, south of the San Diego River. What my research led me to believe was that only the Tipai took part in the sacking because they had the grievances, and also it was clan-oriented, and the clans in San Diego and the alliances go east to west.
I'm really pleased to offer part 2 of my conversation with archaeologist Richard Carrico. In this half of the discussion, we're going to talk about the research that Richard has done on one of the key events in the history of the Spanish presence in Alta California, which was the 1775 sacking and burning of Mission San Diego de Alcalá, the first mission founded in Alta California. And because of the nature of the events that took place, the topics we're going to discuss are fairly mature, involve violence and abuse. And I think that this is an episode that is probably not appropriate for younger listeners. So take that as you will. But for mature listeners, it is really fascinating, and I think you're going to find it very interesting. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation. So maybe we could transition into the topic that we talked about, which was the sacking, the 1775 sacking of Mission San Diego de Alcalá, which is a very foundational event in the history of San Diego and the history of California, for that matter. And as you mentioned, we're up against, I guess it's the 249th year anniversary of that event. Next year will be the 250th. And it also coincides with the arrival of the second ANZA expedition in Alta California, et cetera. So you had a very interesting study on that event, and I'd love to hear if you could recap what you spoke about at the California Missions Conference and anything else you'd like to talk about along those lines.
Sure. Well, back in, let's say, 1990-ish, we'd closed out the Presidio excavation, and I had done the excavation at Mission San Diego that ultimately got closed down. It was to build a parish hall, and everyone told the Monsignor there in 1989-88 to not build it there because there were probably burials, and the first and second mission were on that site, were out there. But he persisted, and I got the contract to go do it. And in doing that, I wanted to really delve more into the mission records and what was going on. So this was 1988, the dig was 89. We dug out there for almost 6 months, and ultimately the tribes closed the excavation down, and the hall got built where it should have been built, in a vacant parking lot, basically. But that led me to looking at a lot of records of the time period when that mission was there. And I was reading about the sacking of the mission and what Bancroft had said about it, H.H. Bancroft, what local historians had written over the years. And I found a lot of inconsistencies and things that just didn't anthropologically make sense to me about it. So the history, the dates were right. The mission was sacked by Kumeyaay people. 3 people were killed, Spanish people. So the history was accurate. But the anthropology of it, the ethnohistory or anthropology, wasn't. So what I came up with and wrote one of my first papers in the Journal of San Diego History, I think it was, in late 90s, was all the Kumeyaay, all 18,000 Kumeyaay, were not involved in the sacking of this mission. It was a very clan-specific sacking, and it was the villages, the warriors south of the San Diego River. So for years, while people knew about it, people didn't address the differences between the group called the Ipai, which is a northern branch of the Kumeyaay, slightly linguistically different, and the Tipai, south of the San Diego River. And what my research led me to believe was that only the Tipai took part in the sacking because they had the grievances, and also it was clan oriented, and the clans in San Diego and the alliances go east to west. They run along the river. And the Tipai clans are different than the Ipai clans, and the intermarriage and all that. So once I got into this diary of the commandant of the Presidio in Spanish, he lists the villages. He tells you every village based on torturing people, torturing Tipai. He tells you the villages that took part in it, and he tells you which villages did not. And this interrogation, kind of like, Abu Ghraib or something, went on for months and months and months and months. So I started making a list. At the same time, I was doing a paper on where were the Kumeyaay villages of San Diego County, and I could do a map and put a dot and go, this one sacked the mission, this one didn't. And when I was done, I stood back and looked at it, and none of them were north of the river, even though they had had rapes and they had had killings, and they had 2 women at one of the villages north of the river hanged themselves because they'd been molested by Spanish soldiers. And so that led to me writing one of the first papers that really got into here's the villages, and not the Native American view necessarily, but here's why they said they did it. It wasn't a military operation. It was to kill Father Jaime, Luis Jaime, because they perceived him as a devil, somebody who was undermining and undercutting their native religions. And yes, they killed 2 other people at the same time, but it was really to kill Jaime and destroy that religious center. Wasn't much talked about in some of the journals prior to that. Kumeyaay men, Tipai men, had surrounded the Presidio. And if the guards would have come out of the Presidio that night, they would have killed them. There were only 25 people at the Presidio that night, maybe 30. There were hundreds of Kumeyaay. But the guard was asleep, didn't call the alarm, and nobody came out of the gates of the Presidio. So they didn't even know about the sacking until the next morning. So that paper that you heard me present was taking a look at it, what was really going on, what were the motives, and in the military or life in general, you look at, was your mission successful? And so your mission is successful based on the goal of your mission. If their goal was to kill Father Jaime and burn the mission to the ground and take those artifacts, crucifixes, baptism fonts that they perceive to be sacrilegious to them, the Kumeyaay, and destroy those things, then they succeeded. Some historians would see it as a failure because it didn't stop Spain from missionizing San Diego and rebuilding the mission. But I believe that wasn't their goal. I don't think they thought the Spaniards were going to run away just because they sacked the mission. So that and the paper I gave that you heard followed up on it and said, well, what happened after that also? And what were the interrogations? And they whipped the Indians. They gave them 40, 50 azotes, and they tortured them. Some died in the prison. So I wanted to follow up on, that wasn't the ending of this thing, this theme. It was the middle. They fomented it, they did it, and then some of them paid the price for it.
Can I stop you there for a second?
Amazing topic.
So going back, just to recap, the Tipai, who lived south of the San Diego River, were the ones who carried out the attack on the mission, and the main goal was to execute Father Jaime, who was the padre missionary at the mission, which they accomplished because they felt that he was attacking their traditional religious beliefs. So why didn't the Ipai north of the river participate in that attack? Did they have the same view vis-a-vis the priest there?
I think they had the same view. Some of the villages north of the river, because they were more isolated, hadn't been contacted as much. So the original mission was at the Presidio of San Diego, 1769. And for the first couple of years, there were no baptisms. No Native Americans came in and got baptized. So now we're up to 1771. And in about 1774, Father Unepero Serra and Luis Jaime, who took over for him in San Diego as Serra went up the coast, agreed that the mission should be moved, that the Native Americans were not going to come into a military institution and get baptized. They were afraid of the military in some cases, and even if they weren't afraid, they didn't like them. They didn't like those men. And also that Presidio mission wasn't very successful in growing crops and having gifts to give to the tribes. And that's, of course, a big selling point. And so they prevailed. Jaime and Serra prevailed, and the mission was moved in 1774. Literally. I mean, they took the baptism font and they took the dados and they took what they needed and they moved them up the mission to Mission Valley, where it is today. And once they were there, Father Jaime then started being successful and went out and baptized, I'm not sure converted, but baptized hundreds of Indians. Most of those, many of those, were south of the San Diego River. There were a lot north of the river, probably more south, because the terrain was more accessible to go baptize people. The villages were a little closer together. But I want to stress, many villages, like the village of Poway here in San Diego, and those along the coast, had a lot of contact. We found trade beads, in those villages. We see them in the mission records. We see baptisms. We see deaths. Some of them even got buried at the mission, came in, some of the Kumeyaay from the coast near La Jolla, came in and stayed at the mission. So it wasn't a complete lack of contact, but I think there was a mentality amongst the religious leaders of the Tipai, the Kumeyaay, that they should be wiping out the mission. And maybe the people in the north felt that as well, but I think the organizational skills were a little bit different. The villages down here were a little more populated. And a friend of mine who works a lot with the Quitsan, used to be called the Yuma Indians on the Colorado River, when you look at that east-west, those Quitsan people were a lot more aggressive. I don't want to use the word warlike, but they were more aggressive, and they didn't put up with a lot. I mean, they're going to close off the trails into San Diego in 1781. So I think there's a cultural thing. There's a difference there culturally. I think the Southern people were more militaristic, and I think their Kumeyaay, from what I can tell at least, were more influential in influencing the headmen and the military men to go do this sacking. Because again, I think it was a religious war in that sense. I think it was a sacred war or a sacred battle to get rid of that problem. And for whatever reason, the people south of the river did it. And about 12 villages were involved, and not thousands of soldiers or thousands of Kumeyaay warriors like people used to say, some hundreds for certain. So that's my take on it. And a couple different scholars, Steve Hackle and Sandos and some other people that I've worked with, as I ran drafts of this idea past them, they said that makes perfect sense from a cultural perspective.
So would you say,
interestingly enough, I'm sorry.
Would you say then that the abuses that we hear about by the soldiers, especially vis-a-vis Native women, didn't play a role or played a more minor role in the attack?
I wouldn't call it a minor role. I think if you look at it culturally, it's for the Kumeyaay as well as some other Native people throughout what's now the United States, the abuse or molesting or raping a woman is actually a sacrilegious thing to do, because you're taking their spirit away from them. You're tainting them. You're making them not so much an unwanted woman like you would hear in some other cultures. It's not that. It's that the woman is perceived to be a very sacred being, and they see things and they hear things and they know things and they give birth and they many cases no plants that a man doesn't know how to use. So to somehow deface or abuse a woman actually has a sacred element to it, and you're desecrating them. So it's very intertwined. It's not just the physical abuse. And we all know, in the times that we live in, that rape is used as a method of warfare, right? To degrade people and to cause morale problems and all that. So I think there was a religious tone to the rapes, if you will, if you look at it from the Native American perspective. It's also, I think, and this is not exactly a feminist approach, clearly, but for many Kumeyaay men and other Native men, those women, be it their wife, their daughter, their sister, at some level belong to the men, not in a chattel or a property way, but spiritually and culturally belong to those men. And so you're also then harming the man by this process. So I think it's a very nuanced. It kind of all fits in together. And I think moving the mission right into the heart of Kumeyaay Tipai territory also was an offense to them. Okay, you're on the coast. You've got this mission inside of a presidio. A lot of our people aren't coming in and being baptized. Maybe you'll go away. Maybe you'll start getting some goods we can trade with you. Okay, stay there. But once they moved 6 miles east and got right on top of a major village called Nipawai and literally built the mission on top of it. In fact, when I excavated it, once we got below the floor tiles, there was a village for 5 more feet. So I think it's very complex, and that's what I was trying to get into. This was not just a battle or a singular event driven by warriors or by military to take out the Spanish colonial. It's much more interlaced than that, and I still don't have all the answers. That's for sure.
I see. That's really interesting, and that makes sense. Well, of course, when you start complicating something, it makes more sense because people are complicated and people's motivations are complex, and there are always layers to things. So that's very interesting and very helpful. So you were going to talk, before I interrupted you, you were talking a little bit about the aftermath of that sacking and how the military, Spanish military, dealt with the guys who carried it out, or the ones they captured.
Yeah, I'm working on a piece on that, and by going through Rivera y Moncada's diary, he was the commandant of the Presidio, so Fernando Rivera y Moncada. So this is 1775.
And Rivera,
he writes his diaries.
Who later brought the group to populate Los Angeles, Pueblo Los Angeles in 1781.
Yes. That was he was one of those guys who not constantly, but often went back down across the Colorado River, down into Sonora, and recruited people, or they'd already been recruited. Then he brought them back up. He brought soldiers from Sinaloa. He brought women up for the first time, a lot of women with soldiers as their wives and daughters, who then became the populations of San Diego and Los Angeles. And he doesn't know it in 1775 or 1776 when he's interviewing these warriors, these cabecillas. He only has 5 years to live. He's going to come across the Colorado River one time too many in 1781, and the Cuitzan are going to kill him, and Father Garces, and everybody with him, except for some hostages. So I think he was a pretty astute military man. I think in his own way, he understood the Native people pretty well, having worked with them a lot. He sends soldiers out to the villages that he knows about, and they arrest people. He did it under Spanish law, and he writes this in his diary. He's obviously writing this so the viceroy and everybody else will see it in the future. But he's saying, following the laws of the Indies and following the viceroy's blah blah blah, I did this. He doesn't want to be seen as a rogue, and unlike some other people like Anza and some others, he doesn't want to go out. He doesn't have the people to do it anyhow. He doesn't want to go out and attack villages for revenge or go out and do a military action. He's not capable of doing it, for one thing, but he doesn't think that's going to be productive. whereas Anza and the more military people want to do that very much. So instead, he sends people out. And in his diary, and then in other articles written by Ortega, who was his lead sergeant, and we've got all of his documents from the Bancroft Library, they brought the leaders back and they interrogated them. And they had a couple guys that were very good Spanish-Kumeyaay speakers, one of whom was named Diego, that I think actually was playing both sides. I think he was a double agent. But Diego is the interpreter. And when you compare his interpretations, literally translations, and another interpreter, they're very similar. So it's not like people are making stuff up entirely. And what you get is, here's the leaders, here's who the leaders are, here's what villages they were from, here's villages that didn't take part in it. And when asked why they didn't take part in it, Poway, for instance, or Istawa along the coast, simply say, I'll paraphrase, we weren't invited. We just weren't invited. So that goes back to your question earlier of why they weren't, because the alliance, that wasn't their alliance. Even if some of the clans were similar, it wasn't part of their alliance. So they weren't invited to come to that war or that battle. You could kind of think about it, the French, the British, the Spanish back in the 1500s, constantly making new alliances. And so sometimes Spain wasn't invited to join France to go do this or that, right? So it's that on that kind of political scale. So he had the authority, Fernando Rivera Moncada and Ortega, to whip these men. If they were obdurate and didn't want to talk, he was allowed to whip them. There were proscriptions. You were only supposed to do 40 lashes a day. You were not supposed to do any more than that. In his diary, he says, I did more than 40 sometimes, because he was being recalcitrant. And what develops is, you can see who the leaders were, both self-identified. Some of them were proud to have done this. Others kind of turned on, somebody, especially some of the people from the Tipai, frankly, who knew who the leaders were. They said, oh, well, we heard, because remember, they're not there. We heard it was Francisco from El Capitan, or it was this person or that person. So we got pages and pages, and when you line them all up and you look for discrepancies, you can see the major villages that took part in it. And back to our earlier discussion, the major village for one part of the county was the Bancroft Ranch House site. It was Mete. That's where they all grouped up. That's where 4 or 5 of the villages met the night before, got their act together, got their bows and arrows, got their clubs, got a good night's sleep. Then the next night went out and took out the mission. So we have all that good information. A neat thing for me is Moncada sent a couple sergeants down by the south end of San Diego Bay, not too far from Tijuana, down there by the San Diego Bay, to go find the cabecillas, the leaders down there. The sun was rising, and the soldiers are moving in toward the village to make the capture. The captains of the village saw this and got in their canoes and went out to the ocean and escaped, basically. And somebody at the village said, yeah, you won't catch them. You won't catch my leaders, because they're in their boats and they're a long way away now. And you can't sneak up on us. We have patrols. So again, that adds a whole other element to it, right? This is not just a one-off, and it's very organized, very organized. Paul Chase gave a good paper and has written about a guy named Naguaso, who was a major leader. And he was brought in and interrogated and refused to answer, wouldn't even speak to people. Father Sarah actually came down from up north and interrogated him and said, we are going to give you the benefit of Jesus here. And if you convert and if you become a good Spaniard here, nothing bad will happen to you. You're clearly a strong, intelligent leader. I want to help you. And Naguaso said, go away. And Chase did a good article on that. And then the next day, Naguaso hanged himself in his prison cell. And not by a long rope. He actually had to kneel down to hang himself and pull his legs up off the floor of the Presidio prison. So that's the aftermath. Another guy probably died from his wounds, another Kumeyaay. The priest describes his wounds as so bad when he saw him from the whippings that there were maggots crawling out of his skin. So that's the aftermath. It didn't just end November 5th or 6th of 1775. It went on for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
And yeah.
Like some of the names that you're mentioning, one man was named Francisco, but the other was named Naguaso, if I remember correctly.
Naguaso.
So were some of these baptized Kumeyaay, who I assume if he has a Spanish name, that he was probably had been baptized. So were some of these neophytes who attacked the mission?
Yeah, I'd say probably 80%. Mm-hmm. 80% of the leaders. And I don't know what percent below that because we don't have their names, but I suspect many of them were, because I think that might have been part of the recruitment. Is you've been to the mission, you see how they can't feed us. They're promising us food, and they're saying this is good, and Jesus is good, but they can't even feed themselves. They allow us to go back in the mountains and gather acorns to feed ourselves at the mission. You've seen the diseases. I think that's another subtext that was going on, but I think it had a religious implication too, is by this time something, maybe smallpox, maybe malaria, maybe measles, was starting to kill the native people at an increased rate. And I think the religious leaders and everyone else in the village knew that, and they associated it with the mission. So I think I don't even know the number of warriors that would have been baptized already, but I think it was probably a very high percent. I think it was a very high percent. And the leaders, at least 80%. And big leaders of big villages, because Father Jaime, like they always tried to do, the Franciscans or anyone, tried to baptize first the elders and the leaders of the village, religious, cultural, military, political, try to get them first. Sometimes it looks like to me, many of the village leaders took the gifts, got baptized as a way of kind of knowing more about the Spaniards. And sure, hey, if you're going to give me a bag of blue and red trade beads so that you can sprinkle some water on my forehead and call me Christian, absolutely, I'm going to do that. So when I go through the baptism records, that's also who they baptize first if they can. They go to the leaders and try to get them to baptize first, hoping that then the tribe or the village will follow along. But when I look at the records after the baptisms, I don't see those leaders showing up for Mass, right? Being baptized is not the same as being converted. Yeah.
How many warriors did you, maybe I missed it, but how many warriors would you say participated in the sacking of the mission?
I'd say between 200 and 300, both, meaning probably half of those were at the mission and the other half were at the Presidio. They'd surrounded the Presidio. They were at the base of the hill. So I can't imagine it being more than 300. Some of the early textbooks, I think Bancroft and some of the others talk about 1,800. Yeah, that's just not possible.
How many soldiers would you say were there, and what was the response, the Spanish response in the moment in terms of defending the mission?
There were only 4 or 5. I mean, don't quote me on this because I have not looked at that lately, but there were only 4 or 5 at the mission, one of whom was killed. And at the Presidio itself, and this goes to the planning, I think. This is not just some random night. The Kumeyaay knew that a lot of the soldiers were up north. They weren't at the Presidio. They'd accompanied other people to go do other missions going up north. I believe there were less than 30 soldiers at the Presidio. 27 is something that sticks in my mind, and it's hard for me to tell exactly because in the documents, they don't always talk about troop movements or who went. They'd say Sergeant so-and-so took 6 people with him north, or they'd just say took his better soldiers. or took his leather jacket soldiers. So you don't get a good enumeration. But based on what I think the regiment size was at the time, and where I know some of the soldiers were, November 5th, 1775, there can't have been more than 30, I think 27. Yeah. And so what happened afterwards? Well, that morning afterwards, the survivors came up to the Presidio, walked the 6 miles to the Presidio, and as they were approaching the Presidio, the guards saw them, who'd been asleep, or at least a guard had been asleep the night before, and sent people down to help them. And then they could look up the valley, because you can see the mission from the Presidio Hill, and they could see the smoke. They could see the smoldering ruins and all that. So what they basically did is they started throwing up pickets around the adobe walls that were not quite finished at the Presidio. They got their rifles out. They got the few cannon that they had ready to go if they needed them, but they're mounted, and one's pointing towards the harbor and one's pointing somewhere else. So they basically sounded the alarm, and many people, based on Moncada, thought at the time they were going to be killed, that was the beginning of an onslaught, and depending on how the sacking of the mission went, the Presidio would be next. So that was their reaction. Then they sent runners up north to try to get Anza and other people, other military, back to defend the Presidio. But they were in fear of their life, absolutely, positively. They did capture a couple Kumeyaay from another village, and one of them said, "Yeah, you're next. You're next. We're going to kill all of you," which I think was just an idle boast, because I don't think that was ever the plan. But it sure scared the heck out of the military at the Presidio. They then went out a couple days later and went to the mission and got Father Jaime's body and the other two people killed, the blacksmith and a soldier, and brought them back up to Presidio Hill, where they proceeded to bury them in the chapel on Presidio Hill. And then some years later, Father Jaime was excavated out of the altar and taken back to Mission San Diego and Mission Valley and reburied there. I believe, and this is going to be in my book, that we excavated one of the individuals who was killed by the Native Americans that day, because he matches all the descriptions, and he was killed by an arrow point to the chest, to the left side of his chest, and 2 in the groin, and then he bled out. Mm-hmm. And we found a Spanish person of the right body type, artifacts, and he still had an arrow point in his chest. So I think we found that guy. Yeah. I'm sorry, for some reason I can't hear you right now.
Yeah, I was I muted myself.
There you go.
Sorry about that. The mission doesn't go away, and it's rebuilt, and the Presidio doesn't go away. The soldiers are still there. What is then the legacy over the next decades of Spanish presence in San Diego in terms of relationship between the Kumeyaay and the mission, the Presidio, the Spanish presence there?
I think it's multi-layered, but I would begin by saying it looks to me, based on baptism records after that, for instance, that more Ipai were baptized than Tipai after that, and I think it was a very conscious effort of both the priest, although I think the priest probably went out and tried to do Tipai south of the river, but it looks like the Ipai were still more accommodating. It looks as if they married into the culture a little bit more. And so they kind of went along to get along. South of the river, what it looks like, because you have the mountainous regions that start a lot sooner, is basically many of the mountain regions went untouched by Spanish colonial efforts. So 40 miles from the mission, up in the Cuyamaca Mountains, you've got a huge village up there, Cuyamaq, and it only had 8 baptisms, but there were probably 300 people living there. When you go to other villages that are further remote, like Hamul, it's not on a major trade route. It's right by the border. It'll be a major trade route later. There were only 5 or 6 people who baptized from there. So it looks to me like there was sort of a detente that took place. The priest probably sensed and sized up, can I get some converts from this village or not? They tried. When they didn't go back. And so you have entire villages that went largely untouched by the conversion process. Doesn't mean they weren't affected by soldiers coming through the area, running cattle off their land, and in the case of El Cajon, raping some women. It doesn't mean diseases, got passed from one tribal member to another tribal member. So it's that old story of infectious diseases. Somebody up in the mountains who never saw a Spaniard could still get measles or smallpox, right, by contagion. So I think there was sort of a balance that took place, although I think it was Ortega, one of the sergeants in his diary says, we don't go east of El Cajon very often. We don't go east of El Cajon because it's too dangerous. So El Cajon's only 15 miles from the mission. And it's called that because it's a valley, it's a box. And after that, you're up in the mountains and you're up where the leaders of the insurrection live and still lived at that time. So when they had to go out towards Yuma, they went south, way south towards Tijuana and came back around that way, or they went way north. So there's a level of accommodation going on there. In the 1830s, the Kumeyaay, again, almost all Tipai, are going to basically sack almost every rancho in San Diego County. They're going to go out and take hostages. They're going to burn them to the ground. They're going to steal cattle.
Sorry, what year was that again?
This was 1835. So this is 1835 through 37. So it's right after secularization, right? And it's after the Mexican Revolution. And so the Kumeyaay see that new soldiers aren't coming in, new supplies aren't coming in. And a lot of the soldiers from the Presidio had retired from the military and got their ranchos, got their land grants, built adobe houses, and lived, in quite a distance from where the military could help them anyhow. So the one that's most famous down here is Rancho Hamul, where the rancho was set on fire and hostages were taken by the Kumeyaay and never seen again. They sent parties out to try to, repatriate them, but they were gone by then. So Mike Conley Mishquish, who's Kumeyaay, working on his PhD right now up at UCSD, I think, he calls that the Zorro period, but it's also a period of unrest. People in Old Town San Diego were living in fear. And they had guards around their house at night at the Bandini house for fear of the Kumeyaay. And ultimately, there was going to be an insurrection in 1835. Somebody ratted them out in Old Town, and they rounded up what they thought were the leaders in Old Town, the Mexicans, by then Californios, and took them down by the San Diego River and executed them. And they're buried down there somewhere. So it was an ongoing process. The Kumeyaay would say they never gave up. They never gave up. Yeah.
Is that...
But some went to work as vaqueros, right? Some married in, some did this. So it varied by your village. And just because you became a vaquero for the Carrico family doesn't mean you still didn't believe in your Kumeyaay religion, or you didn't still do bird songs, or you didn't go off on your days off back to your village and participate in very traditional cultural things. So when I hear people say, and sometimes the Kumeyaay do this, and they don't mean to, they'll say they came in and destroyed all of our culture. I go, no, actually, clearly they didn't. You still do certain things, and there are native speakers and on and on. So it was more, accommodation, I think, on both sides. Absolutely. A couple of the priests that were here were better, quote, better priests. They were more humane. They'd gone, they were a result of the Enlightenment, and that was kind of catching on. But it was definitely a thing of, I'm going to approach your village. I'm going to try to get you to convert. But if you don't want to, I'm probably not going to come back. I'm going to go elsewhere. Yeah.
Today, do those, I don't want to call them divisions, I don't know what you'd call it, but the distinction, say, between the different families and even the different, let's say, the Tipai and the Tipai at that time, do those distinctions or groups still mean something to the Kumeyaay today?
They do, and they did even back during the American period, but it was breaking down a great deal, partially because they were losing their traditional lands from, let's say, the Pacific Ocean inland for 10, 12 miles. They were being, as Florence Shippick said in her book, pushed into the rocks. So as given villages were being abandoned, let's say the village of Istawa, which was right on the coast, and they're north, they're Tipai, they moved basically into Powai, which is a mountain village. So in doing so, they gave up their coastal land and certain traditions associated with fishing and coastal livelihood, and moved up there. But now they're going to be near some other people and some other clans and families. So the intermarriage is going to change. I think a woman named Catherine Luamala talked about Kumeyaay flexibility in their sibs, in their clans. So whereas before you could not, if you were the Fox clan, you were prohibited from marrying into the Raven clan. In this time period starting then, because the population's falling and because you're living in a different circumstance, they started being more flexible about who you could marry. At the mission, if you came into the mission and did actually get somewhat converted, the priest decided who you should marry basically. And then that's going to break down that whole clan organization. So I would say elements of it continued. So when you go and work with, let's say, 30 years ago when I was working with some 80-year-old elders, or 10 years ago with Leroy Elliott from the Manzanita Reservation, he and members of his family still practice a lot of tradition in terms of sweats, in terms of certain days on the calendar that meant something. So like in about a month, the constellation Orion will start coming up right after sunset, and that's the beginning of winter. It's actually, for them, it's a bighorn sheep, by the way, called emu. So Leroy Elliott would still, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, know when winter was starting and do a ceremony in honor of winter starting, because it's going to affect your food supply. It's going to affect the water temperature in the ocean and what fish are going to be there, right? You've already done your acorn harvest. So certain families did. Other families, either because they got sent off to boarding schools, their kids, or because, interestingly enough, they joined the military, especially in World War II, as young men. When they came home, many of those men were dissatisfied with going back on a reservation. They'd seen another world out there. Maybe they came not directly home and married a white girl or a Mexican girl, and now they're going to be disengaged to some degree from their family. So you almost have to look at it, first of all, on a reservation by reservation basis, and then you have to look at it on a clan and family basis. So anytime, one of my pet fetishes, I suppose, or peeves, is when somebody starts something saying the San Diego Indians. That makes no sense to me. I think we just learned that in an election, talking about the Latino population. It's not identity politics. It doesn't work that way, right? And so certain reservations, probably those more remote and those that were set up earlier, let's say in the 1870s, probably retained a lot more of their culture than those reservations set up in the 1800s, early 1900s, because by then they had acculturated a lot, and they are going to be moved to a piece of land that was not part of their clan traditional ownership. The plant's going to be different. The environment's going to be a little bit different, and so they're going to do more amalgamation and accommodation. It's extremely complex.
Sorry, you meant so that the reservations that were formed later, the people there would be changing more, adapting more, or the earlier reservations were the ones where there would be more change?
I think there would be more change in the later ones because those people lived closer to the non-native civilization culture. And when those reservations were set up, I don't know which one of them in the back country, those people are going to be amalgamated. They're going to be taken from small villages and settlements that still remained, like on the edge of downtown San Diego. But those people living on the edge of downtown San Diego in the 1880s, they'd helped build the Hotel del Coronado. They worked on the rail when the rail was coming into San Diego. They had become wage laborers. They probably spoke really good Spanish and some English. And because they're living literally on the margins of San Diego, they're probably not doing as many cremations and traditional ceremonies and girls' puberty rites. But somebody who got a reservation in 1875, like El Capitan, now it's a lake, but El Capitan, they were still practicing their traditions in the 1870s, many of them. So they got moved somewhere, but there's more of a continuum. Whereas for somebody who grew up in the village on the edge of San Diego, the kids might not even speak Kumeyaay anymore. They just speak Spanish because it was not good to speak your native language. So when they finally get their reservation and are moved to Saquon or Barona or somewhere, it's not going to be the same. Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, I've kept you for a long time. This has been a massive treasure trove of information. I mean, this is really, really interesting stuff. And you have put in a lot of years and have a lot of experience doing and thinking these things, and I really appreciate that. One last question: would you encourage somebody, a young person, to go into archaeology these days, especially in California? Is it a viable way forward, a viable career path?
I think that question is first answered by geography. We've got over 80 some tribes, if you will, in California, and some are extremely small, some are huge. Some, as you can well imagine, are more receptive to anthropology and archaeology based on how they've been treated by anthropologists and archaeologists. Others are very resistant. They perceive us to be culture vultures and desecrators and want almost nothing to do with us. So I guess my first answer would be you need to know the tribes that you intend to study and where you think your graduate work might be, or your work as an anthropologist, archaeologist. So if you start with that, and then I know this sounds, whatever, you need to start by being an anthropologist who does archaeology. Because in America, archaeology got divorced from anthropology in some areas. And so you can get a degree in archaeology and take very little anthropology. And if in fact, I think it was, I can't remember the famous scholar back in the 1890s, 1900s said that archaeology is the handmaiden of anthropology. It's a tool. It's not even a discipline in and of itself. It's a subdiscipline of anthropology. So I think if you're the kind of person who wants to know more about people and not artifacts, then I think you could have a good career, especially if you are a humanist and you want to deal with living people. There's a whole set of both archaeologists my age and younger, and now coming up even younger, who frankly don't want to work in California. They want to work in South America or Mexico, where Native Americans are not dealt with in some cases. If you cross across the border here, because I give papers down there and work with INA down in Baja California, you will see a PowerPoint that will show burials. And even the Native Americans in the room do not seem to be, I don't know truly, but don't seem to be disturbed by that. In fact, they want to know more about their past. And seeing a burial on a screen doesn't seem to cause the same emotional issues that it does up here. So I have students and past students who are working down in Baja California and in Sonora because they don't want to deal with the politics and NAGPRA and all of that. So I think you'd have to pick and choose and decide what kind of an anthropologist or archaeologist you are. If you want to go into it and not deal with people, then find some state, and there are plenty of them, that don't deal much with Native Americans. That's kind of a cynical answer, but that would be what I would tell people. If I had it to do over again, by the way, I would do it exactly like I did it.
I think that's the best position to be in, right? Well, thanks so much. Once again, I know you do a lot of things, and I really appreciate your giving up, what is it, an hour and a half or more of your time to talk with me. But I think everybody who hears this or watches it is going to find it really interesting, and I want to thank you for everything you've done. And I hope, at some point in the future, you would be willing to come back and talk a little bit more. I'd appreciate that.
Absolutely. And thanks for a chance to be interviewed. I appreciate it.
I love it. Well, thank you, Richard. And until the next time.
All right. Adios.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code podcast, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.